The streets of Montevideo witnessed something in March 1965 that few residents could have imagined. Among the tree-lined avenues of the Uruguayan capital, a meticulously planned operation was drawing to a close. Herbert Cukers, the man who for decades had lived under the protection of his fame as a pioneering aviator, would finally face the consequences of a past that many believed had been forgotten. Cukers' death was not an accident or an ordinary crime. It was the outcome of an investigation that crossed continents, involved dozens of agents, and represented one of the most complex operations conducted by the Israeli intelligence services during the 1960s. To understand the magnitude of this mission, it is essential to return to the events that transformed a celebrated Latvian aviator into one of the men most sought after by Nazi hunters. Herbert Cukers' career began promisingly in the 1930s when his aeronautical feats captured European newspaper headlines. In 1933, piloting a small aircraft he had built himself, he completed a solo flight to Gambia, a feat that earned him international recognition. His subsequent adventures through the skies, including a risky journey to Tokyo, cemented his reputation as one of the most audacious aviators of his generation. For Latvia, Cukers represented national pride, being sent as a cultural ambassador on several occasions. This fame, however, would later be sinisterly instrumentalized when the winds of war definitively changed the course of European history. With the German occupation of Riga in July 1941, the local Jewish community found itself subjected to a systematic campaign of persecution and extermination. It was in this context that Herbert Cukers' name took on a completely different connotation from that associated with his aeronautical achievements. Survivor testimonies, collected over the following decades, point to his direct participation in atrocities that deeply marked the collective memory of the region. The mass executions in the forests near the city, the burning of synagogues, the nighttime raids that separated entire families, and the Rumbula massacres became inseparable episodes from his name. For those who witnessed these events, Cukers was no longer the hero of the skies, but rather the collaborator who lent his authority and prestige to legitimize acts of unimaginable barbarity. Survivor accounts indicate that his participation was not limited to superior orders or distant supervision. Multiple testimonies describe his physical presence during executions, his active participation in deportation operations, and his role in the logistical coordination of massacres that claimed thousands of lives. Some estimates suggest that the operations under his direct or indirect responsibility resulted in the death of approximately 30,000 people, although these numbers are based on testimonies and post-war investigations, not on formal judicial convictions. The precision of these numbers, however, does not diminish the weight of the evidence that accumulated against him in the archives of organizations like Yad Vashem and in the depositions preserved by refugee communities around the world. When the war ended, Cukers managed to escape Allied justice and settle in South America, initially in Brazil and later in Uruguay. Far from adopting a false identity or living in hiding, he opted for an audacious strategy. He continued to use his real name and actively exploited his reputation as an aviator to build a new life of respectability. In the European immigrant communities of the South American continent, where accents and personal stories were common and rarely questioned, his presence raised no suspicions. On the contrary, his aeronautical feats gave him local celebrity status, allowing him to establish small businesses, cultivate social relationships, and live with considerable material comfort. For his Uruguayan neighbors, Cukers represented an almost romantic figure from the European past. His stories of risky flights and pioneering achievements charmed audiences at dinners and social gatherings, where he displayed photographs of his youth alongside his aircraft. This contrast between public perception and historical reality created a particularly painful situation for Holocaust survivors who followed his new life through informal communication networks. While Cukers enjoyed recognition and admiration in Montevideo, entire families of his victims continued to deal with indelible traumas and the feeling that justice had failed completely. The capture of Adolf Eichmann by the Mossad in Buenos Aires in May 1960 fundamentally changed the scenario for Nazi fugitives in South America. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem not only exposed to the world the extent of Nazi crimes, but also demonstrated that the operational capacity of the Israeli intelligence services could reach any continent. For survivors who had lost hope in formal justice, the operation represented concrete proof that impunity was not inevitable. This precedent created enormous expectations regarding other high-priority fugitives, and Herbert Cukers' name quickly emerged as one of the main candidates for a similar intervention. Survivor organizations began to mobilize more coordinately, documenting testimonies, gathering photographic evidence, and pressuring Israeli authorities to take action. Newspaper articles began to circulate exposing his presence in Uruguay, and delegations from Jewish communities visited Israeli embassies presenting detailed dossiers on his wartime activities. The pressure came not only from organized groups, but also from individual survivors who wrote personal letters, recounting their experiences and expressing frustration with the apparent inaction of international authorities. Every photograph of Cukers at social events in Montevideo represented an additional insult to the memory of the victims and reinforced the perception that the international community had abandoned its commitments to justice. For Israel, a country founded on the ashes of the Holocaust and committed to the promise of never again, the situation created complex political and moral dilemmas. On the one hand, operations abroad involved significant diplomatic risks and could jeopardize relationships with friendly countries. On the other hand, allowing figures like Cukers to live openly as minor celebrities contradicted the fundamental principles upon which the Israeli state had been built. The pressure of public opinion, especially among survivor communities, made inaction politically unsustainable. Every month that passed without an adequate response was interpreted as evidence that official promises about memory and justice were empty. In the early 1960s, Israeli intelligence services began to seriously study the possibility of an operation against Cukers. The first reports about his activities in Uruguay arrived through informal networks of informants, many of them Uruguayan Jews who maintained connections with Israel. This initial information confirmed not only his presence in Montevideo, but also details about his habits, relationships, and business activities. The intelligence gathering showed that, unlike Eichmann, who lived relatively discreetly in Argentina, Cukers maintained a high public profile, actively participating in the city's social life and cultivating an image of bourgeois respectability. The decision to proceed with an operation against Cukers was not taken lightly. It involved extensive consultations between different departments of the Israeli government, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which expressed concerns about the potential diplomatic repercussions of a second operation in South America, so soon after the Eichmann case. The Ministry of Defense in turn emphasized the technical and operational aspects, questioning whether the necessary resources would justify the expected results. Finally, the Israeli Attorney General's office was consulted about the legal implications of conducting extrajudicial operations in foreign territory, especially considering that there were no formal arrest warrants against Cukers in cooperative jurisdictions. After months of deliberation, the final decision was made at the highest level of the Israeli government. Operation Damocles, as it became known internally, received authorization to proceed but with specific parameters that substantially differentiated it from the Eichmann operation. Instead of a kidnapping aimed at bringing the fugitive to trial in Israel, the mission's objective was the physical elimination of Cukers. This decision reflected several practical and political considerations. First, the lessons learned from the Eichmann case suggested that a second public trial so soon after the first might generate international public opinion fatigue. Second, the political situation in Uruguay was considered less favorable for a long-term kidnapping operation. Third, there were doubts about the quantity and quality of documentary evidence available to support a formal trial against Cukers, unlike the Eichmann case, where the documentation was extensive and incontestable. The planning phase of the operation extended for more than 2 years, involving multiple reconnaissance trips to Uruguay and the establishment of a complex logistical support network. Israeli agents, assuming false identities as European businessmen, tourists, and merchants, began frequenting the same social circles as Cukers, establishing seemingly casual relationships that would allow close access to the target. This infiltration phase demonstrated one of the most impressive characteristics of the operation: the patience and methodicalness with which every aspect was executed. The first direct contacts with Cukers were established through seemingly coincidental approaches in social clubs and cultural events frequented by the European community in Montevideo. One of the agents, assuming the identity of a German businessman interested in aviation, managed to cultivate a genuine friendship with Cukers, capitalizing on his ego and nostalgia for his aerial achievements. During dinners and social gatherings, Cukers revealed details about his daily routine, personal preferences and security vulnerabilities that would be crucial to the operation's success. Paradoxically, his openness and sociability, characteristics that had allowed him to live openly for so many years, became the factors that would allow his capture. The intelligence work revealed that Cukers maintained predictable habits and showed no awareness of possible threats to his security. His morning walks, lunches at specific restaurants, and regular visits to a barbershop in the city center created a pattern of behavior that Israeli agents meticulously mapped. Furthermore, his social conversations frequently included nostalgic references to his days as an aviator, but never direct mentions of the war period, suggesting a capacity for psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to maintain his facade of respectability even in the presence of people who might question his past. The operation entered its final phase in March 1965, when all necessary elements were positioned and conditions were considered ideal for execution. The timing was not accidental. It coincided with a period of relative political stability in Uruguay and less presence of police authorities in the areas where Cukers usually circulated. The operational team, composed of experienced agents who had participated in similar missions, established themselves in strategic positions along Cukers' habitual route, ensuring multiple opportunities for intervention should the first attempt fail. On the afternoon of March 23, 1965, Herbert Cukers was approached by two men while walking down a quiet street near his apartment. Later witnesses reported hearing a brief conversation in German before two shots were fired. Cukers was found dead minutes later, with documents deliberately left beside the body that identified the reasons for his execution. These documents, written in multiple languages including Hebrew, German, and Spanish, specifically listed the crimes for which he was being punished and made explicit reference to the victims of the Riga massacres. The message was clear. This was a calculated execution, not a common crime. The reaction of the Uruguayan authorities was immediate, but cautious. Although no organization publicly claimed responsibility for the death, the nature of the documents left at the scene and the circumstances of the execution left little doubt about the origin of the operation. The Uruguayan government, maintaining cordial diplomatic relations with Israel, chose to conduct a formal investigation, but without the intensity that might create international tensions. The local press covered the event as a crime related to the victims' war past, and within a few weeks, the case practically disappeared from the headlines, allowing the city's normal life to resume without major political consequences. For survivor communities around the world, the news of Cukers' death was received with mixed feelings. Many expressed satisfaction with the execution of a man they considered to have escaped justice for too long. Others, however, lamented the absence of a public trial that could have formally established his crimes and created a permanent historical record. This division reflected broader debates about the appropriate methods for dealing with Nazi fugitives and the tensions between immediate justice and formal legal process. Operation Damocles established an important precedent in the evolution of counter-terrorism tactics and extrajudicial justice operations. Unlike the Eichmann case, where the goal was to bring the fugitive to public trial, Cukers' elimination demonstrated that Israel was willing to use more direct methods when it considered that formal courts were inadequate or impossible. This approach would subsequently influence Israeli operational doctrine regarding terrorist targets and would be cited as a precedent in debates about the limits of state action in the pursuit of justice. The impact of the operation extended far beyond the borders of Uruguay or even South America. Other Nazi fugitives living in the region began to demonstrate greater caution, some changing their address or adopting security measures they previously considered unnecessary. Networks of Nazi hunters, interpreted the operation as evidence that cooperation with state intelligence services could produce more effective results than decades of petitions and diplomatic pressure. Simultaneously, host governments of fugitives began to reevaluate their policies, recognizing that the presence of these figures in their territories could create unforeseen geopolitical complications. The ethical dimension of Operation Damocles generated debates that transcended the communities directly involved, reaching academic, legal, and political circles worldwide. The fundamental question was whether states had the right to conduct extrajudicial executions in foreign territory when traditional legal mechanisms failed to deliver justice. Defenders of the action argued that decades of impunity for war criminals created a dangerous precedent that could encourage future perpetrators. Critics, in turn, warned that normalizing state-sponsored assassinations, regardless of the moral justification, could destabilize the international system of law and create precedents for abuses by authoritarian regimes. These debates gained renewed urgency in the 1990s, when massacres in Yugoslavia and Rwanda again exposed the limitations of international legal mechanisms to deal with mass atrocities. The memory of Operation Damocles was frequently invoked during discussions about the establishment of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia in 1993 and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in 1994. Subsequently, the creation of the International Criminal Court in 2002 was partially motivated by the need to create viable legal alternatives to extrajudicial justice, recognizing that the absence of effective formal mechanisms would inevitably lead states to take unilateral measures. For Israel specifically, the operation consolidated the doctrine that the protection of national interests and the preservation of historical memory justified extraordinary actions when necessary. This operational philosophy would later be applied in different contexts, including operations against terrorist organizations and hostile countries' weapons programs. The precision and discretion demonstrated in Operation Damocles became hallmarks of the Israeli operational style, influencing generations of intelligence officers and setting standards for similar operations in subsequent decades. The legacy of the operation was also reflected in the gradual changes in international attitudes toward crimes against humanity and genocide. Cukers' execution occurred at a time when international law was still evolving to adequately address mass atrocities, and the apparent inaction of the international community in the face of Nazi fugitives created a moral vacuum that operations like Damocles filled. In the following decades, the development of mechanisms such as universal jurisdiction for crimes against humanity and enhanced international cooperation for the extradition of war criminals can be partially attributed to the recognition that viable legal alternatives were necessary to prevent similar unilateral actions. The documentation left at the scene of Cukers' death included specific references to the victims of the Riga massacres, transforming his execution into an act of remembrance beyond punishment. This symbolic dimension of the operation was particularly significant for survivors who had lost entire families during the events of 1941 and 1942. For many, Cukers' death represented not only delayed justice, but also formal recognition that their testimonies had been heard and that the memories of their loved ones had not been forgotten. This psychological validation was especially important at a time when the Holocaust was still being processed by the world's collective consciousness. Media coverage of the operation, although limited by national security restrictions and diplomatic sensitivities, contributed to greater public awareness about the continued presence of Nazi fugitives in South America. Investigative journalists began to examine European immigrant communities in the region more carefully, resulting in the identification of other individuals with questionable pasts. This renewed attention created additional pressure on South American governments to review their post-war immigration policies and cooperate more effectively with international efforts to search for war criminals. In operational terms, Operation Damocles demonstrated the growing sophistication of the Israeli intelligence services and their ability to conduct complex missions in distant territories with limited resources. The operation involved coordination between multiple agencies, rigorous compartmentalization of information, and extensive contingency planning that allowed for real-time adaptation to unforeseen circumstances. These capabilities would later be applied in very different contexts, contributing to the reputation for operational excellence that would characterize Israeli intelligence in subsequent decades. The psychological impact of the operation on other Nazi fugitives in the region was considerable, although difficult to quantify precisely. Subsequent intelligence reports suggested that several individuals with pasts similar to Cukers took steps to reduce their public visibility, some going so far as to change countries or adopt completely new identities. This reaction demonstrated that the operation had achieved one of its secondary objectives: to create a deterrent effect that would complicate the lives of other war criminals who had found refuge in South America. The choice not to publicly claim responsibility for the operation reflected careful strategic considerations on the part of the Israeli authorities. Although it was widely assumed that Israel was behind the execution, the absence of official confirmation allowed the government to maintain plausible deniability in diplomatic contexts, while the implicit message was clearly understood by all relevant parties. This anonymous signature approach became a distinctive feature of subsequent Israeli operations, allowing effective communication of deterrence without provoking unnecessary diplomatic crises. The international community's reaction to the operation was characterized by a mixture of formal condemnation and tacit acceptance. Although international organizations expressed concern about violations of territorial sovereignty and the use of extrajudicial force, there was little political appetite to directly confront Israel over an operation directed against a Nazi war criminal. This ambivalence reflected the widespread recognition that traditional legal mechanisms had failed to adequately address the issue of Nazi fugitives, creating a situation where unilateral actions filled a moral and legal vacuum. The case of Herbert Cukers also illustrated the psychological and moral complexities faced by perpetrators who managed to escape immediate justice after the war. His ability to compartmentalize his criminal past while cultivating a respectable public image raises questions about the nature of repentance, moral responsibility, and the possibility of redemption for individuals involved in mass atrocities. For scholars of human behavior and forensic psychology, the case offers insights into how ordinary individuals can transform into perpetrators of extreme violence and subsequently return to seemingly normal lives. Operation Damocles remains a significant case study in intelligence training programs and special operations worldwide, demonstrating fundamental principles of operational planning, risk management, and precise execution under adverse conditions. The operation is frequently cited as an example of how complex political objectives can be achieved through relatively simple operational means, provided there is adequate planning and a clear understanding of the political and social environments where the operation will be conducted. These lessons have applicability that transcends the specific context of hunting war criminals, informing approaches to a wide range of national security challenges. Finally, Herbert Cukers' death in Montevideo represents a defining moment in the evolution of post-genocide justice and the relationship between collective memory and state responsibility. The operation crystallized debates about the appropriate limits of state action in the pursuit of justice, the relationship between international law and morality, and the role of historical memory in shaping contemporary policies. These debates remain relevant today as the international community faces new challenges related to crimes against humanity in contexts such as Syria, Myanmar, and Ukraine, where traditional legal mechanisms are once again proving inadequate to deliver justice to the victims of mass atrocities.